Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing the analysis into theories of ethnicity and nationalism. We're on section 2.1 of my notes. That's page 24. As you know, you can access the notes by clicking the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Just download it and use it to supplement your reading. You can click the link and get the text, Theories of Nationalism, and use it to facilitate your reading. So with that, we're going to begin a discussion of one of the 10 forms of nationalism, that being primordialism. This whole section will just concern various aspects of primordialism. So let's begin with that. And this is section 2.1. Okay. Alright, so primordialism. Okay. Formalized by Shills. And here's a direct quote from the text, right? It's the belief, and the emphasis is on the belief that nationality is a natural part of human beings, right? Could you contextualize this sociobiologically? The argument is probably yes. But the belief, not necessarily in terms of sort of the sociobiological nature, but that nationality and national affiliation is a natural byproduct of who we are as human beings. It's an organic means of how our social interactions develop, right? Organically, our social interactions develop into the need for nation states, national affiliation, and nationhood. And just simply, it's the belief that nationality is a natural part of human beings. In terms of the belief, the reason why I sort of singled out that term is that, without getting too deep into it, at least just now, we just started. But in terms of the belief, that belief needs verification, right? To have a belief is only significant, is only really meaningful insofar as the belief has some possible verification in empirical data in the external world. The manner in which this belief will be verified will be important to understanding this particular aspect, this particular theoretical construct. That being primordialism, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But just sort of in the back of your head, just sort of put belief to the side. The next, primordialism is the givens that stem from being born into a particular religious community, speaking a particular language, or even a dialect of a language, and following particular social practices. Right? So the givens, right? Those things which are always already the case, right? The givens and always already are sort of interchangeably, you can use them interchangeably. These are the givens that stem from being born into a particular religious community, speaking a particular language, a dialect, and following practices. So religion, language, practices, beliefs. These are the four things that we need to keep in mind when we theorize about primordialism. I'll say them again. I've underlined them, but beliefs, religious practices, religion, languages, and practices. As we'll see, in terms of the development of the nation, in terms of how the nation manifests, irrespective of where you live in the world, these four elements are going to influence, if we're talking about the concept of primordialism, we're seeing that it's, as the first bit says, it's a natural development, right, of human beings. It's a natural part of who we are. Well, the beliefs, the languages, the religion, and the practices are going to influence what the nation's going to look like. And this really is significant. The idea is as simple as saying your religious affiliation is probably, with a very high degree of probability, going to be determined by the geographic location of your birth. Right? If you tend to be born in this particular area, it's likely you're going to have this religious affiliation. If you're born in this geographic area, it's likely you're going to have this religious affiliation, and on and on and on. The question is, why is it the case that that has happened? Well, it's the case for any number of historical reasons, development and the ethnical groupings that settled there at some point and such. What's more important to recognize is, since we know that to be true, right, since we know that it is the case, that the probability of you being related to a particular religion directly correlates with, remember, not in terms of proof, but in terms of probability, directly correlate with where it is that you're born, your religious affiliation is influenced by the location of your birth. We have to recognize that these characteristics of practice, religion, language, beliefs also influence and determine the structure of the nation. It's to no surprise that nations located in this particular region have this particular religious affiliation. Why? Because, and speak this particular series of dialects of language. Why? Because in terms of human migration, and I'm not going to go too much into this, in terms of human migration, in terms of ethno-territoriality, in terms of the diversity of dialects and languages, people disperse, and the dispersion and the migration of human populations, of ethnical populations, when populations disperse, they carry these things with them. They carry their languages. I mean, this is obvious, right? This should be, there's nothing revolutionary here at all, right? They carry their languages. They carry their practices. They carry their religious beliefs. They carry all of this with them as they disperse from any given region. In terms of that dispersion, then, and in terms of them carrying this, you can imagine that the further they are, this population who is dispersed from some original seminal starting point, the further they are removed chronologically from the date of first departure, is the more likely that their dialects will form. Same language, dialects will form, right? Customs and practices influence our dialects, influence the way in which we speak. We see this in a contemporary model. This happens in the States within your lifetime. In terms of Ebonics, Ebonics is an official, it's not a dialect per se. I don't know, I'm not a speech sort of analyzer in that sense. I understand speech, but not in that context. But the addition of all these new words within the lexicon of, if you can even call it that, of Ebonics, in my lifetime, I've seen tons of new words come in, and tons of words sort of move out of fashion. So you can imagine, 100 years after the initial date of departure, that language would have changed, right? Just because of natural influence of practice and society and commerce and trade, that inter-exchange with other ethnical communities is going to affect sort of the language. And the language will itself change. The religious beliefs will change. The religious beliefs will morph. It will preserve some aspects of the original seminal influence of the religion, and then it may become more esoteric and more supernatural and spiritual. Well, I mean, it's always supernatural, but more spiritual maybe, right? It may become more, well, I don't even know, I can't really speak on the religious bit, sort of the morphology of religion. It could become more conservative. It can become more sort of divine command in that regard, and more rigorously devout to, what was said and not the interpretation and such. But you can see that we bring with us these inclinations, right, for beliefs, religion, practice, and language. In that regard, then, since all of that holds true, nothing seems too far-fetched. I mean, anthropologists would vouch for that statement. It's sort of obvious. If it's the case, then, that our nationhood, the inclination towards forming national identities and forming nations itself, so that we can identify with the nation, if that's the case, then we leave the old nation, in terms of our dispersion from some original starting point, we leave the old nation to migrate towards a new nation with the prospect of creating something different, with the prospect of creating something new. And in terms of that possibility, hold on a second. Hold on. No. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. In terms of that possibility, in terms of something new, it's important to recognize that. So just to backtrack, because I might have lost you for a little bit, and I apologize for that. But in terms of the dispersion, and the idea is so that you get an idea, right? We have some original starting point, and populations migrate away from that original starting point. and they settle elsewhere. And the idea is, in terms of their resettlement, they bring their language, they bring their beliefs, they bring their religious practices, religion and their practices and such, social practices. But we know the more time that passes from the date of dispersion to some date in the future, we know the more time that elapses, the more likely it is that these groups will change significantly the language, change their practices, change their beliefs. This happens. I mean, there's tons of anthropological evidence to support this. If it's the case that nationhood and national identification is a construct, it is dependent on humans' adaptability. Humans' adaptability to their environment and the ways in which, after adapting to their environment, they create nations for identification. If that also is a product of our being, if you will, then we also take the sense of nationhood. We're not going to leave the nation and just be nomadic. We're not going to leave the nation and be disaffiliated nationally. No, we're going to bring that sense of national identification with us, just like we would our language, just like we would our religious beliefs, just like we would our socio-political practices. We're going to bring that with us in some sort of a civilized sense, right? And I don't mean civil, I shouldn't even have said that word because I really hate that word, civilized. But prior to sort of social contract formation proper. So that the idea is once we establish ourselves, then the idea is identity, it becomes a consequence, right? National identity then is primordial, right? It's on par with religious practice and faith and mysticism and mythical beliefs and narratives and folklore. It's on par with already the given of our linguistic adaptability and our language acquisition and the need to speak and communicate socially. National identification is on par with these other characteristics, these other seminal constructs of human beings. I don't believe in human nature, so I believe that they're constructs. I wouldn't say that they're aspects of human nature because I don't believe in human nature. But they are absolutely constructs of who we are. That is, constructs in the sense of they are the product of the way in which we organize our world, right? The nation is a product of the way in which we organize our world. Language is a product of the way in which we make sense and interpret data and translate that data to others. Our beliefs are inherently a way in which, I mean, in a Kantian sense, right? It's a way in which we organize our world and such. The nation is exactly the same. It's a product of all of that processing. So that no matter where we go, we are going, this is the argument, we are going to seek to reconstruct that macro level mode of personal identification. And that macro level mode of identification has historically been culminated, if we're not talking about language and we're not talking about religion, it culminates in the state, it culminates in the nation. Okay, so you get a sense, right? The nation is always already, and that is true now because they've been so cemented over time. They change and they evolve, but we are born into, right? We are born into the state. The state's already here, and we are born into the state. And our citizenship is bequeathed because of the conditions of our birth, to be honest with you, and that's sort of duh. So that, if you can think about that, there is a means of perpetuity, right? There's a means of, and what I mean by a means of perpetuity, there is already built in the concept of the nation, so for example, the United States of America, a means of perpetuity. How is that the case? If you are born in the United States, you are automatically a United States citizen. It's a means of guaranteeing the next generation of American citizens, the leaders, and thus the preservation of the concept and the ideals of the symbol. If there wasn't that built-in means of perpetuity, then obviously, the concept would erode eventually over time. There would be competition over the concept and such. But there's already, in terms of, and I'll talk about citizenship in a little bit, but in terms of the way in which citizenship is bequeathed for those who are natural-born citizens, just the idea that you could be a natural born citizen, which is obviously socially constructed. There's no need for that particular demand. But the idea that there already is, and there already are conditions that could be satisfied to bequeath the individual, to grant the individual citizenship, is proof that the structures are already in place. They are already functional. And what we do is independent to our will, because we're born into it. What we do is we meet the girl, you meet the guy, you have some babies, and your babies are citizens. Why? Because conditions were constructed knowing that the vast majority of the population, will conform with said conditions, and the satisfaction of these conditions yield the perpetuity of the nation. So that the idea is we, the individual human body, those citizens, become the means of perpetuity. We are the embodiment of the future of the nation, irrespective of what nation you live in, right? So that it really does, at some sense, become... I like this sociobiological interpretation better, because the social is now informing the biology rather than the other way around. When it's the biology informing the social, it gets a bit hokey. When we say that, no, we recognize that our social constructs are self-generated, self-created, completely sort of fabricated, cool, and we're going to use those social constructs and attach citizenship to sort of your birthright, quote unquote. The fact that we know we can preserve the nation and preserve the concept and the symbol of the nation and wed that to biology. The next generation of people who are born in the United States of America will by default be United States of America citizens. That birth is biological. But it's not the biology informing the social, it's the social informing the biological, right? So again, a lot of this lecture series has been sort of inversing some of the original concepts, whether we're talking about ethnical conflict and identities being subsumed by national identities, only to realize that national identities, when we're talking about interdependency, might be facilitated by a resurgence or reinvestigation of ethnical identities, was a bit of an inversion. Similarly, with respect to this assessment, right, with respect to the way in which we identify ourselves, rather than talking about the biological influence of the social and how the biological influences the social, it becomes sort of hokey because it breeds sort of heterosexual normativity and all the problems that I discussed earlier with this sort of concept of enthy and such. It might be more constructive to talk about how the social influences the biological, and the ways in which the social influence the biological is by recognizing the biological facticity in a Sartrean sense, but the sort of physical embodiment of the individual subject, and recognizing that the state has the power to confer citizenship to the biology. Right? If you're born in this particular place at this particular time or in this particular condition, you are an automatic recipient of that which the state bequeaths, which is, and it confers citizenship. So, sort of, I think, for me personally, I think that's pretty interesting concept. Let's move on though. The 4 categories of primordialism. Sorry, let me throw this out. 4 categories. 4 categories of primordialism. So the primordialist has a belief, a quote, this is a quote, so the primordialist has a, quote, belief in the representation of the nation as a mystical, atemporal, even transcendental entity. That's just a great quote, right? The primordialist has a belief in the representation of the nation. So the first thing that we recognize is that the nation and national identity, is representational, right? So for the primordialist has a belief in and representation of the nation as mystical. The nation represents itself as mystical. and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Right? The nation represents itself, right? It's representationally mystical. Atemporal. Right? Representationally mystical. Atemporal. Even transcendental entity whose survival is more important than the survival of its individual members it's supposed to be at any given time. Okay, so the last bit, its survival is more important than any individual's members or citizens' survival. The author put it in there, it's a bit ominous, right? It sounds a bit ominous, but the obviousness should be direct. That the identity of the nation transcends ethnical identity, and we spent a lot of time talking about that. And since individual people comprise ethnical groupings, the identity of the nation transcends the individual. It's not, however, to say that because this is the case, that the individual is completely expendable, right? That's that great scene in Rambo 1 where he's on the boat, and the Vietnamese lady who's on the boat with him reassures Rambo that, Rambo, you are not expendable, like you're important. That's a good feeling, to feel that you're not expendable. But the truth of the matter is, well, basically everybody's expendable. For the most part, for good or bad. The expendability of any individual person is less of a concern than the expendability of whole segments of the population. It might be the case, and I'm not arguing that it is the case, that individual people are expendable. But it's absolutely not the case that collective groupings are expendable. We need collective identification. The nation needs collective identification. The nation might not need me, they might not need you, they might not need some Nobel laureate, what have you. But the idea is the nation needs groupings, right? For any number of reasons that I don't want to get into now. So we have that bit. So I don't want to spend too much time on sort of the negative part, which was, it's not necessarily negative, but it sounds a little bit ominous. Its survival, the survival of the identity. They're not talking about the physical, structural survival per se, but even transcendental entity whose survival is more important than the survival of its individual members at any given time. That part, again, is a bit sort of murky, and I don't want to spend too much time on that because it can be contentious. Let's look at what I think is the interesting point. First of all, it's a belief. The primordialist has this belief. Now, in terms of our belief, without getting into a discussion on philosophy, we can think about belief in basically the simplest way, in sort of gradations of belief, right? So before I get to this, just sort of gradations of belief. Oops. And I'm not going to go through the whole spiel. At the bottom, right, so verification. And this is dependency on, right, the dependency on verification. The dependency on verification is very low. The dependency on verification is increasingly high. The idea is we live in a world that is constructed by rules. I can't say the whole universe is, who knows. But this world is constructed on rules. These rules are numeric for a large part, right? And they are pretty much rigidly defined. We know that this is the case, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we know that this is the case because we're able to build stuff like this. We're able to do stuff like this. That is, you're able to watch a digital me because people recognize the rules of binary via Leibniz and blah, 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 and all other types of crap. But we do stuff with these rules. So it's not something that we have to have faith in. We do stuff with this. So in terms of belief, faith is a type of belief. And this is not to be pejorative in any sense. This is, because I understand Kierkegaard and I've read it and I understand the role of faith and so on and so forth. So this is not to be pejorative, and this is absolutely not to apply any of this to religion. I'm not having a theological discussion here. This is in terms of the dependency or independency on verification. Quick gradation. A lot of this applies to Plato's hierarchy, epistemic hierarchy. So you can watch my video on that if you want to have a more rigorous account. But this is an amalgamation of several theorists' thoughts to just quickly give you a taste of what's at stake here. So at the bottom is faith, right? There's no dependency on verification whatsoever, so it has to be the bottom. Faith, I have faith in X. Okay, why do you have faith in X? I have faith in X just because I have faith in X. You can be dogmatic. That's the whole point of dogma. Dogma affords, again, not being pejorative, not dissing people's religious beliefs, just as a fact. The idea is you can be dogmatic with respect to faith because there is no need for verification. Why do you believe in X? I just believe in X. Well, that's the answer. That's as good as it gets. Is that a mode of belief? It absolutely is. Is it a mode of belief that is heavily dependent? No, it's a mode of belief that exists completely independent to verification, which is what it is. We have conjecture. Again, I'm not going to go sort of in the Plato's hierarchical model because that's not this, but we have conjecture. I have a sense that it might be the case that this might be possible, or this might be a condition. And conjecture is okay, but the idea is my conjecture is almost always a consequence of, shout out to Chomsky. Chomsky comes in here at this level. Chomsky, he basically owns this level. In manufacturing consent, a lot of the consent that we give as citizens in a nation is contingent, and you do really have to pay serious homage to Chomsky. Not all the Chomsky wannabes, but to Chomsky himself, for the brilliance of sort of the idea and the recognition of manufacturing consent. If I tell you as a professor that it is X, and you hear me say it is X, and at the dinner party with your friends later on this day, you say X, and everybody challenges, and you say, well, no, I know it's X. I'm learned. I read. I watched these videos, and this guy's gone to school for years, and it's X. What you're sort of parroting is conjecture. You haven't done what I've done in order to be able to make the statement, my statement and your statement, despite the fact that we're making exactly the same propositional statement. My statement is different from yours because of justification and such. And I'm not going to get into justify true belief and all that other crap. But I've justified, hopefully if I've done my work right, I've justified the statement itself. This perfect example is in the AP right after post-Katrina. And you can see how this is going to turn into the nation in a little bit. The AP right after post-Katrina shows a picture of a black guy. He's looting a picture of some white kids, white dude and a white chick, and they're foraging, or they found or waded through the water, and blah blah blah. And it's sort of obvious. And then people appeal to the authority of the Associated Press and say, well, see, black guys are looting. Well, what you're saying, you're making claims. Your claims do have reference in reality. Your claims could or could not be true, but you don't have the epistemic means of understanding how. You don't know how to validate those propositions. You don't know how. You don't know the process that would be needed in order for your propositional claim to have truth functionality as true. That's, of course, assuming monotonic logic, right? Some truth propositions are fuzzy. They're not exactly true. It's more or less true, but I'm not going to get into that. It's a whole different tangent. So that conjecture is a step up, right? So I can say that I have faith in something. I can say that I have conjecture. I can say that I have, and again, not to do Plato here, because I'm not, so I'm forcefully going to change it. But I can say that I have an understanding of something. Right? I can say that I have an understanding of a condition, right? That I have an understanding of how things work, and that my understanding of something is clearly better than conjecture, right? Between conjecture and understanding, however, and Plato doesn't go into all of this, would be sort of inference and deductive relationships, right? Just super quick, and I can keep it here, so that we can have inference and deduction. I'm not going to go into all of that. I can infer, based on any set number of reoccurrent phenomena, that X will happen. It's been the case that this has happened, for 100 years. It's likely to continue happening. My justification is based on the reoccurrence of the phenomena over a period of time. Thus, I know how to justify my propositional claim. It refers to something beyond myself. That thing beyond myself has this regularity, and I recognize and identify this regularity, and I'm able to make propositional predeterminations, prescriptions based on that regularity. Very good. Deductive, really not the opposite, but a different sort of approach. I'm able to deduce or reduce from some assumptions, from a set of premises, a truth that inheres within those premises. And I'm able to apply more rigorously, if I need to, rules, or just more sort of colloquially, I'm able to apply people don't realize there's a lot of intuition and deduction. There is intuition and deduction. I'm able to apply intuitively what I feel to be laws, what I feel to be rules regulating the structure of these relationships, and to arrive at some truth. You can recognize this is sort of the use of inference and deduction is more empowering for individual citizens in terms of their ability to process the information that they're given. Right? So that I can hear something when I watch TV, and I'm not just going to parrot what I hear because I watched it on TV. No, let me go fact check that. This is the quote-unquote fact checking, right? Right? And you can fact check it inferentially, or you can fact check it deductively. So that fact checking is entailed within inferential and deductive reasoning. You can imagine the distinction in the constituency in terms of a constituency that has been educated to use and implement fact checking as a mode of what is coming next, understanding. Well, we'll go right. It's concept formation and then understanding, but I'm not going to go into conceptions and conceptualization now, but understanding and then sort of knowledge at the top, right? Right? To say that you know something means that I truly do understand it, right? I can implement the scientific method and reproduce the findings of the experiment. I can look at a text and identify analytically the logical formulation in this text, the text's mathematical representation, and assess the validity based on what someone said or what I heard. So this is pure knowledge in its realest sense. And understanding, less than knowledge, is I have an understanding of the Krebs cycle. I have an understanding of mitochondrial sort of the role of the mitochondria, right? I understand what it does. I couldn't explain to you I couldn't say that I know this stuff. You know, you went to high school, you take an intro class of biology, in college. Okay, the information's there. If someone's talking about it, I have an understanding I can pick up. But I couldn't teach it, right? Knowledge, this is what I said in the last series, knowledge is best had once you have the ability to sort of instruct, I believe. Those who know, teach it. Now, in relationship, so that I don't get too far off tangent, in relationship, you need to know this, all right? But in relationship to the state and the identification with the state, the reason why I spent so much time on this is that it's important to recognize that the belief, and I erased it. Oh, here it is right here. The primordialist has, quote, a belief in and a representation of the nation as a mystical. That belief is going to vary. For some, the nation as a mystical, atemporal, is conceptually mystical. It's conceptually atemporal. Right? I can use inference and deductivity to recognize that my nation wasn't founded. Again, not that I need to not disrespect North Korea, but I'm not going to disrespect other people's nations. But in the United States and the West, it's kind of bizarre for us. We're religious, but we're secular. Our daily lives are secular. It's hard for us to swallow the pill that says your national leader is a godhead, right? It's kind of hard for us to swallow that pill. Yeah, we mean mystical in a sense, right? So Abe Lincoln was this, and George Washington never told a lie, and everybody was. Yeah, we understand that, but nobody really believes that, right? We tell this to perpetrate the myth or perpetuate. To perpetuate the myth. It's a moral story. It's about how we should conduct ourselves as citizens, but nobody believes that. I mean, children believe it, but no adult believes that. Why? Well, I can't say no adult. Adults who exercise inferential and deductive thinking know that it's not true. To take the mystical characteristics of the cosmogony of the state, because states have cosmogonies as well. Sort of the origin story of the state, which is already going to be mythical in a sense. It really is. We fight the oppressive Brits, and through the Boston Tea Party, that was the culminating event that led us to blah, blah, blah. It was far more complicated than that, right? But you have this sort of great American picture of how it is we came to be in your respective nations, how your nation came to form the identity that it has. It's important to recognize that this belief is going to vary throughout the population. Some people in the population are going to have faith in the narrative of the story. They're not going to be interested to do the fact-checking. They're not going to be interested in anything other than just, okay, they said it's the case, so it must be the case. Okay. Some parts of your constituents are going to parrot what they hear in the world, right? This is sort of the method in which consent is manufactured. Yeah, I agree with what I heard because they did all the hard work to find out that information. So I know it's legitimate because I can say that, you know, he did the work, and he would never manipulate me. He would never misdirect me or misguide me. So it must be true, right? Chomsky did, you know, canonical research on this bit because all too often people are misled purposefully, right? You have to learn to think for yourself so that we can recognize in terms of the nation. And the very last section of this is about the use of symbols. And if I do a second version of this, which I am not sure I'm going to be able to do a second version because we're already well into like 16, 17 hours now, into this series, which is substantial enough, the idea is if I do another installment, like a part 2 of this, I want to do a lot more of the symbology, right? Because I do like the idea of the implementation and the use of symbols in terms of national identification, because it plays into our systems of beliefs. And everyone isn't going to see and experience the nation in the same way because the way in which we think is going to differ throughout the population, right? So I don't want to spend too much more time on that point, so let's go to 1A. So in terms of nationalist, an inherent attribute of human condition, right? This goes in line with the primordialist standpoint, right? Just like language, just like the proclivity for religious ideology or mythical or folklore ideology, not to pair them all up, you know, but I'm just sort of via Joseph Campbell. So folklore, religion, myth, narrative, just like our inclination for that, just like our need for social interactivity to some degree, varying degree, the idea is the nation is organic. It is a consequence of an internal condition that has to manifest itself socially, right? The way in which I like to interpret it, rather than saying that the biological informs the social, I like to say that the nation is a consequence of our social interaction, the need for our social interaction, and you can recognize that the need for social interaction necessitates collective identification. It's just a fact. The need for social interaction, which is, that you ask any sociologist, you ask any anthropologist, you ask any biologist, you ask probably even geneticists, they might be able to find a gene for that. Which is weird, but I hope they don't find the gene for that. Maybe they could turn it on or off. I don't know. That would be super weird. Good, interesting sci-fi for the future. I shouldn't even put that out into the world. I feel bad for even saying that now. But the idea is, no, we do have a need to socially interact. Since we have a need to socially interact, we're going to, necessarily, using inference, we're going to end up forming groups. I'm in this team, I'm in this group. You can recognize that that group affiliation will eventually manifest, not in your local PTA or the smaller group. Your group is going to manifest in the nation. And the way in which that formation occurred, the way in which the series of events that led to, this would be the cosmogony, the series of events that finally led to the formation, the codification of national identification in law. I mean, yeah, that's the stuff of legends, right? That's for whatever nation, anywhere in the world, right? It's not an easy thing to accomplish, right? National identification. But the point is, the belief is going to vary. The belief is going to vary based on the representative constituency. 1B, the assumption is human beings can only flourish, quote unquote, this is subjectively interpreted, if they belong to a national community, right? This is a bit a harder pill to swallow, right? The idea is flourishing is already subjective. But we can only, as human beings, flourish if we belong to a national community. Now, that would be a good debate point. I'm not going to sit here and be a dogmatist. I'm an ideologue all day, but I'm not a dogmatist. You can be an ideologue without being a dogmatist. I don't know that I would make that move to agree wholeheartedly with the claim that flourishment, human flourishment, is indelibly linked to national affiliation. If we mean by national affiliation sort of the traditional state-based affiliation, because I see on the horizon bigger possible affiliations. Again, I've said this throughout the series. If you think about the European Union is bigger than any one nation, and there is identification. There's individual, personal, subjective identification with Europe, with the Union. Again, as I said, I don't know what that feels like. I don't know what that feels like because all I can identify with is being an American, right? Maybe hip-hop, but, and hip-hop is global, so I guess that's the biggest thing that I identify with, bigger than maybe American, I guess, is hip-hop, which is absurd. It may be true. I don't know, hip-hop versus USA, there's a pretty huge battle. I'm being facetious here, I mean, it's obscene. Of course, the United States is bigger than hip-hop. But you get the idea, right? A union, right? We're not talking about a nation, we're talking about a collection of nations. A collection of nations with shared goals, with shared economic, social, security-based interests, and the corresponding population's allegiance, if you will, with maybe a small a, and affinity and identification with. Now, I'm not European, so I don't know what that feeling is like. It would be interesting, and I might, now that I've said it, look to see, Europeans talk about what that means to them and how it feels, because I just don't know. It'd be interesting to hear. But the idea is, in terms of delimiting that sense of flourishing to exclude everything other than flourishing in relationship to national affiliation might be a bit much for me. I don't know if I can necessarily agree with that. I could be wrong, but that bit on primordial, I can't really be wrong because it's my own interpretation. That bit of primordialism, the rest of it I can deal with. That bit is a bit of a stretch, right? I can see that national identification and the creation for the conditions of the nation are inherent within us as a consequence of social interactivity and thus collective identification, and thus the culmination of collective identification in the nation. But this presupposes that collective identification reaches its apex at the nation, and I don't believe that, right? So if the assumption is, as a consequence of collective identification, which was itself determined by social interaction, the nation becomes the apex with which personal identity can be affiliated with national identity, then I think that's wrong because of examples that I just gave. But that's a bit more nuanced. So let's look at 5 themes in forming primordial nationalism. So the first bit, and I'm going to go through and talk about the other 3 categories in a bit. So the first point is the notion of antiquity, right? This idea of the ancients, if you will, antiquity. So aka perennialist point of view. This is going to be the perennialist point of view. The historical need to ground and legitimize national existence within the historical context of its emergence. The need to ground national identity within a historical context. You can see that this is going to be remnant of a more nostalgic time. It could be aristocratic in a sense, depending on how you apply this. But the idea is national identity is grounded in that tradition. It's when we talk of the nation, we are the people of Here's the historical root for our national identification. It is rooted in a century ago, 2 centuries ago, a millennia ago, we didn't have the name, whatever our name is now, but we are the same people. We are the people of. That's sort of the sense, right? That's the tone. So the idea, I can say it when I read it, perennialist point of view, The historical need to ground and legitimize national existence within the historical context of its emergence, I just gave that. The preconditions for the emergence of the United States predate 1776, right? So you could, it would be a bit of a stretch because the United States is such a sort of young, comparatively speaking, nation. If you think about globally, you think about China, you think about various countries in Africa. There's no question that, you know, if you think about Greece, I mean, there's any number of nations that are way, way, way older than we are. I mean, we're 200 plus years. The idea is, if we were going to use the United States, is to say that the United States is actually older than 1776. Obviously, it was codified, it was legalized, it was internationally recognized as sovereign prior, but you would talk about the emergence of the nation as a condition of injustices maybe that existed in Britain 100 years prior, 50 years prior. The role of enlightenment, the role of Locke's writing, the role of XYZ influencing the need for this mass migration from Britain. It's once those acts of insubordination, if you will, start to arise in Britain, that you might be able to root the United States at a very sort of ephemeral level, a very, ethereal, a very ethereal, because it hasn't evaporated, but a very ethereal level at that point. And you could, you know, it would be interesting to see, historically speaking, that would be a good read, it really would. Like, this, you can imagine that this would be, like, it would end with the codification. So if this were a movie or something, the last shot would be, you know, the signing of the Declaration of Independence or something like that. That would be the end of everything that led up to that. Would attribute to this and this ancient narrative. Now, granted, for Greece and for many of the Arab worlds, Persia, Iran, and such, I mean, this goes. I mean, that goes back to Xerxes. I mean, in terms of Persia and such. But the idea is the ability to root your national identity prior to its just sort of legal codification, and to articulate the historical narrative that legitimizes the nation's existence historically. It has a profound power, right? Narrative has power. Narrative coupled with really good historians who do it well, whew, you can't beat that. You really can't. You really can't. Okay, so the idea of the Golden Age, Egypt is always the ultimate reference. Most of the readings that I do, they always sort of harken back to Egypt. And obviously, Egypt existed for millennia, right? Egypt existed for a long time, and they were at the cutting edge of everything. So there is a high degree of reverence. There ought to be, and there is gladly a high degree of reverence for the structures in place to lead to their establishments globally and the power that they were able to exercise globally. In terms of sort of this harkening back, this golden age, this nostalgia, there is a really super thin book. I did a lecture series on it. It doesn't really have, it's called Revolt of the Masses. Jose Ortega y Gasset wrote the book, and Gasset's Revolt of the Masses is a really good book. Just to, it sounds as though the revolt is this violent bloodshed revolt in the streets. It kind of has those implications, but it really doesn't pertain to that. And I'm not going to go into it now because I have a lecture series on it already. But the idea is one of the aspects of this national origin, this cosmogony, is a looking back at a time when we had to overcome the great villainy, the great evil, the great injustice of the world. And that's where the seedling of the nation was rooted. And in times of weakness, in times of national crisis, it's always a good idea to go back to that story. That story of, so in terms of the United States of America, it's the story of independence. I mean, clearly. It's the story of expedition and exploration and frontiersmanship. And if frontiersmanship is a word, I'm not sure. It probably should be. It's that sort of explorative, inquisitive, independent streak that's uniquely American. And when we as Americans, I don't know everybody else's story, but when we find ourselves fighting in a difficult situation, evoking that independent streak is meaningful for us because, hey, I don't want to do what you're doing, but I'm going to do my thing, and I know that in the United States of America, my thing could potentially pay off big for me. If I'm after money, I can get money. If I'm after power, I can get that. If I'm after affluence or fame or what have you, I can get what I want. I don't have to follow the herd. I don't have to be like everybody else. I can be myself, because that's what this nation was built on. It was built on being yourself and, pulling yourself up and blah, blah, blah. A lot of that, just even to evoke pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's particularly conservative here in the States, but I like it. I like the term a lot. I like the concept a lot. Because it captures the spirit of our particular nation. Now, for everybody else's nation, you have your own narrative, your own myth. And I don't mean that pejoratively, but you have your story of what it is to be a countryman or a countrywoman. In our nation, that's the narrative, right? The golden age was the age, and it will always be the age of independence in the U.S. I mean, it will forever be that. So, superiority of national culture, this is where it gets a little scary. Obviously conflictual and antithetical to 21st century global interdependence. Yeah, this is old world stuff, right? The superiority of your culture is a wrap, right? That doesn't have any place at all in 21st century globalized sort of market economy. And I hate to put it in terms of market economics. People are like, well, why would you say that? Why would you say market economy? Because it's bad for business. Ignorance and racism and sexism and elitism is bad for business. And at the end of the day, it's about whether you want to believe it or not, right? At least from my interpretation from this lecture, and my own personal beliefs, at the end of the day, it's about money. It's about making money. It's about using money to do stuff, right? It's not that money is the end all. I don't believe that. I think people who really have tremendous power in this world and influence in this world recognize that money is the greatest means ever made. Right, and I believe that to be true. It's the greatest means ever. But money as an end, that gets boring. I mean, okay, so you got, trillions and billions of dollars. Great. If you're not doing anything with that, then what's the point of having it? The whole point is to use money as a means. So for me, in a global market economic, to say that our culture, our national identity is superior to yours means you can't really export your brand. Nobody wants to buy that product. Nobody wants to buy the product that says, it's good to be like, yay, we're the best, yay, our country's the greatest. Okay, sure, because everybody's number one. I get that. But to say, here's why we're so much better than you. Let us count the ways of, your people are uncivilized, and your people are ugly, our people are pretty, and our roads look like this, and your roads look like that, and look what we have, and look what you don't have. You're not going to be able to export your brand. Nations are sort of like brands. And you want to be able to buy that brand. So a quick side note, it might seem tangential, but it's not. I'm in the States, obviously. I live in South Florida, which is amazing. It's very diverse. I think New York and LA might be equally amazing. I might be jealous to live in either of those communities, but South Florida is a great place to live. And you'll be here, and you hear it on NPR, you hear it on the radio, but it's amazing. It's one thing to hear it, it's another thing to see it. So Spanish is a given. But they're like, no, there's more prominence on Portuguese and Brazilians. And you're like, yeah, I hear it on the radio, but I haven't really seen it yet. And then you get out into the world and you hear it. You're like, oh my goodness, yeah, that person's talking Portuguese. Like, you can start to pick it up now. I can easily pick up Spanish. I don't speak it, but you can identify when someone's speaking Spanish. Now I can identify when people are speaking Portuguese. I'm like, oh, that person's speaking Portuguese, and that person. Brazil's exporting itself, right? Brazil's doing great PR now. Brazil's saying, hey, guess what? We recognize that it's about us selling the Brazilian brand. Us, Brazil, selling our Brazilian citizens. And our Brazilian citizens are great people to have as neighbors. They're great people to have as residents of your particular country. They'll spend money. They'll be good to your nation. They'll come back. They'll be good snowbirds, what have you. Well, not that they need to be snowbirds, right? They have an amazing, well, it depends, there's economic disparity. But you get the idea, right? The world is open to Brazil. The world is open to Brazil because they have what Jamaica used to have, right? Jamaica lost that, unfortunately. That very carefree, that very sort of business-oriented but still relaxed vibe, non-oppressive, non-encroached vibe with money to spend. And the idea is the world will be open for business with Brazil because they're marketing their brand well. So the idea that there's a superiority of national culture in this era, it's a wrap. That's just, there's no room, there's no room for that. It's just not good for business, right? It's not good for business to have that very sort of elitist mentality. All right, top of page 25. So, an awakening from somnolescence, right? An awakening from somnolescence, right? You can imagine a very somber, soporific, sort of easy, slow, lethargic, my national culture is a culture of ease, is one thing. It's one thing to say, you don't want either of the extremes, right? You don't want to say that my culture is a culture of superiority and domination, and you don't want your culture to be too relaxed, too chill. It's sort of like a medium, right? And the idea is to awaken the spirit, right? And I'm not going to go into this. Hegel talks a lot about this, almost ad nauseum, and it's so freaking profoundly complex what he says. But to make a very long story really, really condensed, Hegel ends up articulating the conditions for, as bizarre as it seems, the transcendental subject. The individual. It's not the Uberman, but the individual that is also atemporal, right? It has exactly the same characteristics almost, right? This has a lot, sort of the German concept Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, right? That sort of the time, the spirit being the Geist. The nation has a spirit to it. And this is why I don't want to get too mystical, because it gets all sort of mumbo-jumbo, if you will. So in a secular sense, the nation has a collective sentiment, the world's population. When you say America, maybe not now, let's say like maybe in the 50s, right? We have some PR work we have to do ourselves as well. We have to sell the American brand as well. We're not exempt. So let's just say 50s, like Leave It to Beaver time. We know that it wasn't as projected in Leave It to Beaver, but Leave It to Beaver was freaking Leave It to Beaver. Right? So the idea is, this is the American dream, right? This is the house, this is the white picket fence, this is suburbia, this is protection and security. We are at the cutting edge. Our textile industry is booming. Our national security is, it's insurmountable. We have the world's greatest technology. We have the world's greatest minds. This is it. Everybody wants to come, right? The idea of this somnolescence, this receding vibe, this lethargy, is a consequence of having reached that apex. There is a point at which, unfortunately, the spirit can be changed. I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's a lot of that sort of supernatural stuff. But if you think about it, just in terms of a narrative, the hero is on the battle to slay the evil dragon, right? And the hero climbs to the top of the mountain, and the dragon descends from the heavens, and he's fighting the dragon, and he's tirelessly fighting the dragon at the peak of the mountain, and lightning and storms. And you can imagine, just paint the picture, you're there, right? Finally, the hero slays the dragon. Yay, everybody cheers, they see the dragon fall. Now the hero has to descend. But when the hero descends, he's battered, he's bruised, he's broken, he's exhausted, he's vulnerable. He's vulnerable, right? The hero is usually most vulnerable after his biggest victory, right? And it's that, and there is a need nationally to make sure, wherever your nation is, that we recuperate quickly from tragedy, that we recuperate quickly from victory as well, that there is a quick recuperation process, because if we're in a slump economically, socially, if we're in a slump in any way that you can conceptualize it, now out of the spiritual into a realistic, if you're in a slump for a long time, you think the beasts of the field aren't going to recognize that weakness? Vultures flock before the prey is dead in many instances because they can see it. So there's a huge exertion of energy that could lead to demise, and the idea is, it's almost like a phoenix narrative, right? It doesn't have to be the destruction, but at that state of one's own personal weakness, a recognition that, hey, I'm in a really weak state right now, for whatever reasons, now is the time that I operate. Now is the time that I get into drive. Now is the time that I exert it and build yourself back up, right? Because it has meaning. In terms of, I talked earlier about consumer confidence. In terms of consumer confidence, it means something, right? It turns into real stuff. It turns into real confidence, right? It manifests itself empirically and such. So it's important to recognize that. All right, and then I didn't even see National Hero. National Hero, it's funny, honestly, I did not see that, but it worked in perfectly, and I'm going to break after National Hero before I go to 2. But the idea of the National Hero, the nation could itself be the hero. It's rare that the nation is ever fully personified in this sense, as fighting the dragon and such. But usually we can talk about any number of national heroes. We have treasure troves of national heroes, and the idea is it facilitates a need for individuals to see in themselves, to see in their personal, daily. You don't have to live the most lavish lifestyle. Most of our lifestyles are mundane. My lifestyle is extremely mundane. In the most banal activity, in the most mundane act, to see in ourselves the propensity for heroism, right? And it's that the nation should instill, right, within its constituents, within its citizens, is the recognition of their own potential to act heroically. And this doesn't mean you go off to war and pick up a gun and fight. No, this could be as simple as teaching. It could be as simple as being a postal worker. It could be as simple as making a video lecture for other people. It doesn't have to be revolutionary. Though obviously the Revolutionary Act is incorporated in this, right? Though the Act of Defense is incorporated in this, every individual citizen of any nation can make, this is JFK, I mean, clearly, this is JFK, right? Ask not what your country, your nation can do for you, but what you can do for it. And the idea, I mean, you can take that too far, but the idea is, no, what can I do? What talents do I have? What services do I have? What can I contribute? Because, in a sense, we all have something to contribute. And if that is the case, if we recognize that, then what I said before, that expendability becomes less and less likely, right? Because the nation needs various talents. There's any myriad number of talents that the nation needs, and you are not expendable if you can offer something. If you can't offer something, that's a different story. If you can't offer something, the nation readily needs, any nation, not just the United States, and I'm back in the propaganda mode, but it's true, the nation needs your help, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to pause at this point, and then come back. Okay, so number 2, sociobiological. I talked about this in a previous section, and I basically spent the whole section just completely destroying this concept. And I thought about sort of how I lectured on the topic. It's the first time I've done literally hundreds of hours of lecturing. It'd be good on a side note to sort of tally up how many hours I've actually lectured, but it's ridiculous. And I've never done a lecture like that. And I had to think about, well, what was it that disturbed me so much about this concept, why I basically spent the whole hour and a half just knocking it. And as a social scientist, I'm very, very cautious to make sure that the concepts I'm working with, that the theories that I'm working with, despite the fact that I'm trained as a philosopher, my BA, my MA, my PhD, all of my education, all of it is in philosophy. All of it. Proper. I got all my degrees. I have all of my degrees in philosophy. So it very sort of esoteric thought, very sort of, abstract thought. But the one thing I realized, even as an undergrad, that I just did not personally want to be, I just don't want to be one of those scholars who none of my theory, none of the ideologies, none of the things that I conceptualize or think about are applicable to anything in reality. It's all sort of argument for the sake of argument. Not to disparage philosophers, but let's keep it real. So I was bent from day one to me. I was determined to make sure that everything that I discussed was based in empirically verifiable conditions. I didn't want to be the guy who someone thought, oh yeah, he just sat at the desk and just cooked this up out of nowhere and this is the theory. don't want to go back and berate it even more now after having done it, because it's sort of like adding salt to the wound. But a lot of the social biological stuff to me just sounds like, you know, like a hodgepodge of the worst elements of social theory. Right? I do understand that our biology influences our social practices. I get that. And if the argument is simply our biology influences our social practice, our social habits, that's cool. I'm fine with that. To say that there is proof, to say that there is determination, to say that our biology necessitates particular acts in society is absurd. It's absurd. And I refuse, and I apologize if this offends social biologists, and if I'm completely ignorant, maybe 5 years from now I'll change my position. As of today, my position is, yes, I do recognize that biology influences, but it's nature, nurture. It's both. It's not nature or nurture. It's nature and nurture. Biologists will tell you, geneticists will tell you, if you were to clone Albert Einstein and make Albert Einstein 2.0, Albert Einstein 2.0, though he is genetically identical, though he is living, the tissue is identical genetically with Albert Einstein 1.0, Albert Einstein 2.0 will not have the same, he won't do the same stuff with his brain, because it was his social conditions that influenced him, right? It was, to be honest with you, personally, I think it was, he wanted to give his noble money to his wife. I think his wife motivated him to do all that damn good for the world. He just wanted to give her that money, right? And I think he did. So, shout out to Einstein's wife. If it wasn't for her, we wouldn't have the theory of relativity. It's pretty freaking significant. Who knows what his motivate, but whatever it was externally, socially influencing him, those influences, it might not have meant anything to you, might not have meant anything to me, but it meant a whole lot to him, and he did a whole lot based on that. So that the idea that it's determined biologically is freaking absurd. There are any number of variables. There's any number of contributing factors to why people do what they do, why people act the way that they act. And to say that it's all reducible to biology, which I know that's not the claim, but to even approximate that concept to me is it's too ridiculous for me to really give it too much of my time. So sociobiological arguments hold that, quote, it's needed, and this is poorly written, sorry about that, is needed to, sociobiological, I guess, belief, is needed an objective, doesn't make any sense, is needed an objective external basis to the existence of such ethnical groups without denying these groups are also socially constructed, consequence of genes, etc. I apologize for that paragraph. That paragraph is horrifically cited. And I have where I got it from, so I might take the time to go back. But I already did a whole hour lecture series on, sociobiology. And I'm not saying sociobiology isn't a legitimate thing. There are various aspects, the enthy and all that other stuff, and how it affects our social mindedness. And I get the genes at the wheel, fine. I understand that our genes sort of are really, at the end of the day, in control of our biology, which is a host. Okay, I like that. It's a bit allegorical. It's a bit too narrativistic for me. I like my science really dry. I don't like sort of metaphors and language about truck driving and all that other stuff and roads and streets. Give me the dirty science, right? That's what I like. In terms of the influence, though, again, it can only ever be a correlation. It cannot be a proof. It cannot be a proof. If it's a correlation, it's high or low degree of probability, as best as you're going to get. So that the idea is, me personally as a scholar, I bow out of that. That's not my field. I'm not interested. It's not to debase people who study this, and it's not to sort of belittle the field itself. Me personally, I have, just on my own personal experience, from my own private reasons, I don't like where too much narrativized allegorical language informs scientific fact. Scientific fact should be boring, it should be dry, it should explain the world in a boring, dry manner. I don't want to hear about genes behind a truck driving on a road where the body is the road and the where the body is the truck and the road is what? Oh yeah, whatever. You know, I just don't like it like that. So again, sociobiology, we get the idea. Biology informs social, but we've seen how sociobiological concepts. We've seen how social Darwinism, as social Darwinism, biological, right? Social Darwinism as one aspect of the pseudoscientific operationalization of social biology destroyed 13 million lives. There's a reason why I'm as cautious about this topic as I am, because it was operationalized to exterminate 13 million Jews. That's and others and you know, any number of other groups. So not just to generalize and say it was only Jews. A lot of people were slaughtered. Of various types of people were the types of people are ridiculous. We're all human beings. Were slaughtered in concentration camps and at the hands of the SS and such. But the idea is, you know, social Darwinism was a hoax. It's pseudoscientific. Social Darwinism is social biology. I just, you know, again, sort of intellectually averse to this system of belief. And I don't care how good the science is. I'm always going to be, you know, I like my social and my social. I like my biology and my biology. I understand that there's a hybridization between the two and there's an influence between the two. But with respect to that, I'm not going to really, unless there's overwhelming empirical analysis to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that this is a condition, and I haven't seen any research that has been that convincing that I'm like, oh no, I can buy into that now. I can buy into that sort of social influence because, you know, it's been reproduced throughout the globe. You know, it was, you know, triple blind and blah blah blah. Until that exists, I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna lecture on it. I'm not gonna spend any more time. So number 3, how much more do we have? Just a little bit on the next page. Quite a bit on this page though. Culturalist, aka cultural primordialist. Obviously, culture as one of the seminal aspects of who it is, what it means to be human beings. Again, I don't think, and it would be interesting, I could be wrong, but I don't think to be a primordialist, which I'm not, but to be a primordialist, the individual has to avow some belief in human nature. I think you can be a primordialist without believing in human nature. It might be difficult, but I just don't believe in human nature. So anything that, for me, devolves, other people would argue with me, but anything that devolves into the assumption that there is this thing called human nature already is spooky to me. Again, I'm not saying that you have to be as stringently sort of reductivist in your belief. I'm not that reductivist. I'm not necessarily reductivist physicalist per se. I do leave some room for, you know, things that can't really be explained too clearly. And physics and such has room for that. But in terms of my social understanding, in terms of cultural, absolutely, I have no tolerance for it. I have no tolerance for sort of allegorical language in that. So there is some debate concerning the nature of these givens, right? That is, and not even just the nature of these givens, human nature itself being the greatest given, right? Sort of the nature of human nature. There is some debate concerning the nature of these givens, that is whether they are in and of themselves determinate causes for national identity, right? Nationhood, or whether they are assumed. For me, I again, you know, some people will say, no, it's determined by our biology. Okay, great. I haven't seen a convincing empirical argument to prove that. Right? I don't know how you would even be able to find the nation gene, right? I mean, if you're going to reduce it all the way, I guess there would have to be a nation gene. So that just sounds hokey to me. I think it's more of an assumption. I think it's more of a consequence empirically, inferentially, right? Just sort of inferentially, we are social beings. We can test that. We can see that. You can even talk about the biological determination of our sociality. No problem. In terms of our socialization, not socialization, but in terms of our sociality inheres within, it necessitates collective identification. It inheres within identity. Our sociality, it's inextricably bound to identity. That identity has to be social because we're not talking about one person, we're talking about a group of people. And then you can think of various sizes of groups. Thus, the bigger the group, right? Not the more that one's identified, just the bigger the group. You think about the biggest group, well, the biggest group's the nation. Okay, fine. See, you don't need all that extra stuff. You can just you can infer the nation, right? To say that it's biologically reducible is a bit of a stretch. You can just infer the nation. I think the nation is a necessary inferential consequence of our socialization, or of our sociality. If you think about our I'd say it like that. To me, that just sounds better. We might be saying exactly the same things, but the way, and this is just my own bias, the way I'm saying it, I like better than the way it's being said. The way it's being said makes it sound like our biology is creating our social. And that just sounds ridiculous to me. Anything that even approximates that tone, I just don't like. I'd rather say that, no, our biology determines to some extent, or influences, or you might be able to, if geneticists can prove that we are social. I mean, we see our sociality in our actions daily. All of our structures, our religion, our institutions, education, our banking, everything is social. So our sociality is obvious, right? It's ostensible. You can point to our sociality. Thus, the nation is a consequence of the inferential generalization. Not to be technical, but it's a consequence of it's hygiene, really, is what it is. I could probably formalize this now that I think about it, right? The nation is a consequence of our inferential generalization based on our sociality, right? We are social beings, and as such, you generalize that sociality to its grandest sense, and it's the nation. However, there's stuff bigger than the nation now, so we're going to generalize it even bigger in the next 50, 100 years and such, right? So, I mean, for me, that just has a more logical tone, and I like that story better, personally. And that's what I'm going to teach, because I don't teach that other stuff. I interpret them as an assumption. I interpret them, and I just said this, right? I interpret all of this as an assumption, being that ethnical identity is biologically real. And I just told you why, right? I think it's an assumption that we make this assumption. More importantly, I could probably, to be even more rigorous, say that, now that I just said it, I didn't think of it when I was writing this, but I think it's a condition of maybe our logical wiring. The rational mind is wired in such a manner that we can inferentially generalize, right? We can inferentially generalize based on a certain pattern. Well, I don't want to get into this, right? But no, I can't. You can do this. You can do this logically. I probably could do it. So I think it's more logical, right? I think it's more logical than biological. I think biology gets the ball rolling, but logic is what sort of gets us to the end state, right? The nation is logical. And logic is clearly, I mean, there's no question, cognitive scientists have infinite amount of research on the logical wiring of our brain. Our brain is a big processing machine, as a fact, right? So we embody logic. Some people do it better, some people's wiring do it worse, but I think the nation is a consequence of that logical structure, right? To keep it sort of rooted in the empirical world. So 3b, primordial sentiments are ineffable, overpowering and coercive. If an individual is a member of a group, I missed the first one, sorry, 3a. Primordial identities are given a priori, underived, natural, rather than sociological. Okay, sure. The a priori identity, I have a huge problem with. I don't even know what that means. Primordial identities are given, and this is a consequence of I'm not a political scientist, so political scientists might have a better interpretation of how to make sense of primordial identity. The way that I interpret it as a philosopher, rooted in logic, to be a priori is to be true by definition. So the idea is that the nation has a definition, and the definition is the nation, and the identity is an identity that's definitionally defined. It's determined identity by definition. That can't possibly be the same thing as what I think about when I'm talking about nation. When you're talking about, so that's why I completely disagree with number 1, 3a. And not to say that I believe in primordialism either, right? Because I don't. I take aspects of it. This is definitely something that I would argue against. I don't even know what that means, right? Primordial identities are given. I mean, I know what it means, but it doesn't follow. A priori, underived, natural. Okay, so just so that we're clear, it's not the case, right? These two are not compatible at all. These two things are not compatible. You have the definition is equal to the term, right? Nation is its definition, and the definition is the nation. And then my idea of USA. These two things are not the same. My idea of USA is a concept, right? I have this concept, I have this idea. If I were to articulate it, it would point to the concept USA. My idea of USA is a concept. I could utter the word USA that would point to the concept, and the correspondence between what I've said and the idea that I have, it's called a signification. I'm not going to go into this. I have a whole series on semiotics, but the correlation between the utterance and the concept conjoined is called a signification, so that the signification is completely different than this. They're two totally different significations. When I talk about the nation and primordialist and its relation to sociobiology, I can't mean this. Right? I mean this. I mean, when I say USA, that means something to people. Okay, I'm going to say USA. What does that mean to you? Oh, they'll tell me a narrative of what that means. They're not going to give me a definition of, well, USA is United. I guess you could say USA is United States of America. I guess you could say that, right? It would be weird, right? You find out one guy in the crowd, be like, hey, I'm gonna tell you a word, and I wanted to tell you. No, if I say what that means, you couldn't. If I say, this is weird, right? Now I'm on a huge tangent. What does it mean when I say USA? When I say I'm going to tell you a term, and when I tell you this term, I want you to tell me what the term means. Okay. USA. Could you say USA means United States of America? I guess you could. Say it does mean the United States of America, but no, I mean. So yeah, I don't know. At that point, maybe there is some overlap here. Maybe conceptually, you could probably do it. You have to forgive me. I'm like real time. Probably conceding a point of disagreement. Maybe I do agree with this. Primordial identities are given. Primordial identities are given a priori. No, something about that. I'm not going to take the time to sort of flesh this out now, but I still don't. I'm not buying that, because when I'm thinking USA, I'm not thinking a definition. The ultimate referent, isn't in a book. It's not even. It's like Uncle Sam and an eagle and the freaking Statue of Liberty and hot dogs and hamburgers and Budweiser. I mean, that's where my brain goes, right? My brain doesn't go to United States of America. So I don't know. Actually, 3A is, I'm gonna put a little star by that. I gotta think of like this on a side note. Primordial identities are given a priori, underived, natural. I can see primordial. See, I don't know how much the person who wrote this knows Kant and the categories. The author is treading into that sort of that philosophical tradition, and to try and root that discussion of the nation in that tradition just seems very bizarre to me, because there's so much already presumed in national identity. It's a little off. Forgive me. 3B, back on track. Primordial sentiments are ineffable, overpowering, and coercive. If an individual is a member of a group, he or she necessarily feels certain attachments to that group and its practices. I mean, that's obvious, right? The idea is, when I said USA, just on the fly, hot dogs and hamburgers and beer. I mean, that kind of is. It kind of is USA, right? Hot dogs, hamburgers, and beer. That basically corners a huge market of what it is. No, I mean, I'm joking, I'm teasing here. But yeah, people, the individual members of a group, they feel attachment to that idea. Which is why I don't think it's a definition, because I don't know that you can, no, it's definitely not this, because you're not attached to the definition. Right? For them to say, see, no, I am right. Because one and A and B, they don't seem, there's something that cannot be reconciled. How can you feel an attachment to an a priori definition? Right? You don't. You know it, you can utter it, you can state it, but there's no attachment to it. You're attached to something that exists, and that thing is a concept. When I say USA, I'm thinking about this concept. I'm thinking about colors, I'm thinking about smells, I'm thinking about 4th of July, I'm thinking about music, I'm thinking about, it's amazing, Bruce Springsteen, right? I'm thinking about stuff like that. I'm not thinking about anything else, right? I'm thinking about that. so the USA is bigger than this definition. None of that is the definition of USA. It's not even the word United States of America. It's that, again, whatever your particular country is, wherever you live in the world, it's exactly the same vibe. Obviously, I'm doing a global lecture for everybody, and I can't talk about everybody's nation, and I can only talk about the things that I know, so I'm talking about the United States. So forgive me if I'm, if this is just over, but this is a national, this is a lecture on national identity. I mean, what else can I do? But forgive me if it's a bit too much. There's nothing I can really do to stop that. But yeah, in terms of that attachment, the two are not interchangeable. Number 3C, primordialism is essentially a question of emotion and affect, meaning influence. And it's true, right? It's the way in which, as a product of who we are, how we're constructed. I'll grant that bit in biology. That's fair. I don't have a problem with that. The way that we are, the way that we're wired, the way that we're constructed, each of us are wired in a certain way. I definitely believe in the relationship between neural wiring and emotionality and the way in which we see things and our optimism, I believe, our pessimism. I think a lot of this can be conditioned socially, and our wiring obviously changes based on intoxication and experience and different acts of euphoria and dedication and habituation. But a lot of that I think is wired, so I'll grant that. But the idea is it really is about that affect that we have. What is your interpretation? It's funny, you go through YouTube long enough, you sort of troll YouTube. I do this all the time. No, I don't troll at all, so I take that back. But I'll like randomly click through videos. I'll start like a chain, right? I'll go from one video to another video with no intent, just to see what I can stumble. I can go from one point to another point. How the hell did I get to this part of YouTube? And after a few clicks, you're gonna get to Illuminati and conspiracy theory stuff. And I occasionally, I don't do it much anymore. Occasionally I watch one of these guys. It's typically a guy. It's almost always a guy. I watch one of his videos, and you see it in his face, the fear and the anger in his face, and he's telling you, the U.S. government is going to destroy its citizens, and they're spraying chemtrails in the sky, and they're poisoning the water, and they're killing our, they're killing us by, the stuff they put into the food, and everyone's going to destroy us, and these dudes are scared as hell, and they're angry as hell, and you see it. It's not fake. You see it in their face. You're like, this dude's official. Like, he really sees that. That's the affect he's getting from the state. He feels that in terms of the nation. And then you come to my channel, and I'm doing 16 hours of Go USA, barring one section, last section. I mean, which is true. I guess it's true. It's contingent on the person, right? I guess it's contingent on the person. But the truth of the matter is that the way in which the constituents are going to, and this is very important, the ways in which constituents for any nation are going to interpret this affective relationship, this influential relationship, is directly, I erased it, is directly tied to how they have arrived at their beliefs. How did you arrive at your beliefs? I don't want to put out my personal information, but so let's just say, theoretically, that you have a friend. You know this is a joke because I don't have any friends, but let's just say theoretically you have a friend, and every time you come to your friend, you see this guy or you see this chick, it's always like, oh my goodness, here's the latest website, and don't forget that they're poisoning the lakes, and oh, here they're poisoning the rivers, and oh, they're killing the this, and oh, they're killing that. And I mean, you can find anything on the internet to justify any belief that you have. And I don't care how obscene your belief is, somebody posted a video on it already. So you can find the verification that you're looking for, if that's what you're trying to do. In terms of that affective relationship, the way in which the constituents are going to tell the narrative of the nation, the way in which they perpetuate the nation, is going to be based on how they feel. It's a very emotional, this is a great point, right? This point I will grant, right? Primordialism is essentially a question of emotion and affect. I mean, that actually is key. It really is, right? So I might not believe everything, but that's a really good line. A lot of national sentiment, you ask about disloyalty, right? People will say, well, how do we, why did this person choose to become a saboteur? Why did this person choose to be an agent, a spy for some other government? Think of like a Bond movie or something like that. Or why did this person turn against his or her country and, defect? aside from just like obvious greed and financial bits, just like ideologically defect from the nation for which they are affiliated, it's because of emotion, and it's because of a feeling. Just like the strength and the effect that we have in our interpersonal relationships, where spouses and partners and friends decide to leave for justifiable reasons, it's exactly the same in terms of the affect of the nation. And I think there's a tremendous amount of psychosocial work that could be done here, right? So if you're a fledgling psychology student, right, I think psychosocial research into how people formalize their epistemic understanding of that affect, that affective relationship with the nation would be, wow, stellar research, stellar. I would love to read that stuff, right? Because it is psychosocial, right? It is the way in which psychologically the individual interprets any number of things. What you have experienced and I have experienced, despite the fact that we have experienced exactly the same thing. So the phenomena is X, and two people experience exactly the same phenomena, but I interpret the phenomena as positive, and you interpret the phenomena as negative, where the origin of this phenomena was from the nation, whatever that might mean. Well, I mean, why was it, Jason, that you experienced the same thing that Bob experienced, and Bob's freaking out? He thinks it's the worst thing that has ever happened, and you sort of don't. It would be great. It would be amazing. That would be some heavy research for a graduate student to look into. So 3C is critically important. Primordialism is essentially a question of emotion and affect. Granted, I always take points like that beyond the theoretical paradigm. If you don't like primordialism, fine, scrap it. Who cares? But the idea that questions of emotion and affect are important to understand the citizen's relationship, the citizen's affective relationship with the nation is huge. And maybe someone has already written on this subject. I don't know, but it just interests me now. Number 4, perennialist. Perennialism refers to those who believe in the historical antiquity of the nation. Talked about this earlier. 4B. In contrast to the culturist and the sociobiological theoretical positions of nationalism, they, quote, do not treat the nation as a fact of nature, but they see it as a constant and fundamental feature of human life. I do like that bit better. I don't like the idea that the nation is itself sociobiological is just so bizarre to me. And I told you I just don't like any of it. The idea that the nation is a construct of, but they see it as a constant and fundamental feature. The idea that the nation is a feature of human life is good. I like that. I could be wrong. You can disagree with me. But the idea is it being social, it being biological, social more than biological. It being a consequence of the stories that we tell ourselves about our collective grouping, our collective identification, our collective and shared historical memory is, I think, more in line with the truth. More in line, I don't really believe in truth, but more in line with the fact, right? With the fact of the matter. So in terms of the facts, and the inference to the best explanation that we have at any given time based on any given amount of information, the nation, for me, seems to be more of that, which is the nation is the consolidation of the collective narratives told of its people in a given time, in a given geography, in relationship to given facts of the matter. It's that, right? It's not as gratifying as maybe a more well, that's pretty concise, but it's not as gratifying and maybe a more allegorical definition. The definition I just freestyled was horrible. I wouldn't write that or publish that. But you get the idea, right? The nation it's bigger than just, the territory at latitude, longitude that occupies borders XYZ and is bordered by XYZ. That's not what the nation is. The nation is its people. It's its practice. It's the way of life. It's the stories that we tell of ourselves and who we are and our identity, individually and collectively, more so collectively than individually. And it is the relationship that the nation has to other nations and the historical context. I like the historical bit more. So the perennialist is a more sort of gratifying interpretation. And then lastly, on page 26, two versions of perennialism. One, continuous perennialism, which emphasizes the continuity in identity. See the concept of antiquity in one of the themes of perennialism. I already talked about antiquity, right? But it's the continuity of the identity. Despite the fact that Persia, Iran was Persia, it's one and the same, right? Despite the fact that nations change their titles, change their names, they are continuously evolving. But it is really one and the same structure. It's just the transconfiguration of the structure, right? Not to be sort of, well, you get the idea, right? It really is sort of the configuration of the structure. But now, the status, sort of the myth that we tell ourselves about this structure is one of the changing and adaptable nature of the nation, right? So it's continuous. It changes its form, it changes its name, but it's one and the same thing. That's the continuous position. The next is the recurrent position, and this is the last bit for section 2.1. The nation is viewed as a category of human association that can be found everywhere throughout history. Particular nations may come and go, but the nation itself is ubiquitous. Right? So the category of human association, I like this a lot. Right? The recurrent perennialism is simply that. It's reoccurring. Right? It's I won't say hermeneutic, but it is reoccurring. It's the way in which a category of understanding has been formed in our consciousness, biologically speaking. That category refers to a concept that speaks of the shared identification, which is territorially contingent, which is regionally contingent, which has certain criteria. That is the nation. We identify as a category of thought, and it would be good to have the definition of what just the raw sort of OED definition of the nation is, right? The nation is a priori As a category of thought, we have that thought. I always use the word muggle, Rowling's muggle, an individual who can't practice magic. Okay, we've had that thought for centuries, ever since we started talking about magicians and magic, and we had an idea that we could make demarcations, those who can practice magic and those who can't practice magic. Those who can practice magic were called magicians. Those who can't practice magic were unnamed until Rowling. Rowling recognized this and called them muggles. Now we have magicians and muggles. Perfect. In terms of a category, muggle is a category. The category represents those who cannot practice magic. And even more so, the category represents individual muggles as persons. Similarly, in terms of the nation is a category of thought, like muggle. It points to a formalized idea, and I would have to read now the definition of what a nation is. So imagine that I'm reading the definition of nation now. A nation is ... Okay, yeah, we have that category. And that category applies to any number of nations, right? It applies to Turkey. It applies to Russia. It applies to the United States of America. It applies to XYZ, right? It applies to all of these different countries, and that category applies. So in terms of that recurrent explanation, you can see it's very logical. I really like that bit, right? It's just, yeah, the nation is a category of thought that we've reserved, just like Mughal, and it refers to anything that fits the definitional criteria. And in that regard, it is absolutely true by definition. The only problem I have with that is not that this exists. I believe that it exists, obviously, right? It's just that when I don't have attachment to that, my attachment is something bigger than just the definition. My attachment is existential. It's lived. It's phenomenological. It's something in the world. So it's, I mean, at that level, it becomes far, far, far more complex, right? The nation is part linguistic, the nation is existential, the nation is phenomenological, it can be experienced in the sense. It would be interesting to see. It's definitely, well, so there is room for debate in some of that, but I'm not going to touch that now. So, that concludes section 2.1. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.